Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Fallout 4 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. No, just kidding. Happy April Fools, everybody. This is actually my review of Ride to Hell Retribution for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3, and it's coming to you courtesy of the inhuman monster known as Gamma 12. So I guess thanks for that, asshole. This is a third-person action game developed by Eutechnyx and published by Deep Silver in June of 2013, and it's kind of weird how this thing actually came to be, because it started out being announced in 2008 as an open-world biker game, which sounds like a pretty cool idea, actually, because we don't really have anything like that in the gaming scene. I mean, I know a lot of people would be really interested in an open-world game that is styled after Sons of Anarchy, but that was not to be. It was reported that the game was canceled before it was scheduled to be released in 2009, but Eutechnyx actually kept working on it, and eventually they did re-announce it and release it in 2013. And it proved to be a total disaster. It was critically panned across the board and is often considered one of the worst games ever made. Now, of course, I know that people tend to overhype that up the wazoo and act like things are way worse than they actually are, so I'm like, okay, look, it can't be as bad as people are saying it is, right? And I was right about that. This isn't the worst game ever made like people tend to claim it is. And at this point, you're probably just going, oh, well, DW's obviously contrarian. Oh, don't get me wrong. This game is still fucking atrocious. It's one of the worst games I have ever played. But it's not the worst game ever made. I know this is actually pretty hard to believe, but there are actually things in this game that don't completely suck. But of course, all will be revealed in time, so just sit back, relax, and buckle your seatbelts because things are about to get really shitty. I guess the best way to start this review is to explain to you the first impressions this game made. The game opens up with an 8-second cutscene of you driving your motorcycle along the road, followed immediately by a turret segment. This is followed immediately by another 8-second cutscene and then a QuickTime event brawl. This cuts immediately to your player character standing over another character who you learn about later on in the game, and ends up shooting him, which is followed immediately with a quick, awkward cut of your character continuing to drive his motorcycle until he jumps over a helicopter into the screen and it comes up with the logo. This cuts immediately to a loading screen, which cuts immediately to another cutscene, this time the actual intro to the game. This incredibly poorly assembled montage segment is the tone setter for the entire game. Not only is it incredibly confusing, and not only does it show you what's actually going to be in the game, driving your bike, shooting stuff, and punching things in the face, but it also shows you the presentation itself is going to be incredibly slipshod, very poorly assembled, and generally pretty lazy when it's not outright incompetent. The graphics themselves look like a game that was released about a decade before it actually was. Crappy modeling, very low-res textures, animations that look like they were put together by a total amateur at best. Explosion and particle effects that look like they're straight out of the PS2 generation. Absolutely massive amounts of texture pop in to the point where when you go into a cutscene, more often than not, it won't have loaded all of the textures in until a good 5 to 10 seconds into the frickin' cutscene. Graphics and animation glitches up the wazoo. They are friggin' everywhere in this thing. Invisible walls like the one you see in front of you where our bullets are impacting thin air and not doing anything. Now admittedly that's not really a graphics issue so much as it's a hitbox issue, but the point still stands. This thing has tons of problems in the presentation department. It comes across as something that was slapped together at the 11th hour, and that's being generous. But I do also have to admit there is one element of the presentation that wasn't completely foobarred. The loading screen art. Everything else looks pretty damn awful. Now where the presentation very slightly redeems itself is in the music, and I say that only because it has a couple of licensed tracks that don't completely and utterly suck. One of them is Pressure and Time by Rival Sons, which is basically a rip-off of Led Zeppelin's Out on the Tiles, so it's kinda hard for them to screw that up too horribly. But other than that, you're dealing with a soundtrack that plays the same handful of tunes over and over and over again, and they're all incredibly simple. Hearing the same 30 or so second loops over and over and over again gets very tiring very quickly. But here's the thing. That's the best part of the presentation. The rest of the sound design consists of sound effects that are downright awful in nearly every regard, with the same basically 2 explosion sounds over and over again, with weapon sounds that are incredibly pathetic, incredibly wimpy melee combat sounds, and my personal favorite, overpoweringly loud engine noises.
Boss, why didn't you stick up for me? Jesus, Mike, I've been gone, okay?
The sound mixing in general is just incredibly terrible, from cutscenes that have basically no sound other than the actual voice work, to sequences where you're driving down a road and 2 people are having a conversation, you can't hear what they're saying because the engines are too loud. It basically ends up sounding like whoever ended up doing the sound mixing just had absolutely no idea what they're doing and just screwed everything up. But you know what? I decided to save the absolute best part of the presentation for last, and by best I mean worst. I want you to sit back and listen and marvel at the glorious voice acting this game has. Enjoy.
My brother, man. You here for home improvement?
I knew it. Some big shit is going down because it ain't seen him for weeks.
Thanks, man. See you around.
Oh, Suki. Oh, wow.
And that's just a small sampling of the wonderful voice acting this game has, and by wonderful, I mean downright horrible. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set in the fictional town of Dead End, somewhere out west. And you play as Jake Conway, who returns home after the Vietnam War to his brother and uncle, and almost immediately after his brother throws a bit of a tantrum and drives off on his motorcycle, you end up running afoul of the Devil's Hand biker gang who, for some baffling reason, wants you dead. The reasons for this are given later on in the game, of course, but I'll get to that in a moment, because in the immediate, Jake ends up getting shot while his brother is killed, and they end up running off and leaving him for dead. Only Jake survives it and vows bloody revenge upon the Devil's Hand. So the entire game is a revenge story of Jake just slaughtering the Devil's Hand because they killed his brother. It's assembled in a pretty flimsy way, and when you get further into the game and the reason for why they wanted you dead is revealed, the entire story just falls apart because you're like, really? You actually had build-up for this reveal, which was frankly pretty pathetic? And it's not like the build-up itself is actually any good. None of the characters are interesting in the slightest. They're all cardboard cutouts at best, and at worst, they might as well just be stick figures because they have literally no personality. I almost feel like issuing a challenge to you guys to actually try to find a single solitary reason to give a single flying fuck about the actual plot, because I couldn't. And what makes it worse is that the plot itself just drags on and on and on because there's so many completely unnecessary gameplay segments dragging it down that it ends up actually being worse than it would have been if they had just made it a ridiculously short game. You see, this game has the gall to drag out what probably should be maybe a 3 or 4 hour plot at best into about 8 hours, which means that you are dealing with the absolutely cringe-inducing dialogue for way longer than you should. You're dealing with the gameplay mechanics, which I'll get to in a moment, for way longer than you should. And you're dealing with the completely asinine plot for way longer than you should be even able to tolerate. In fact, most people couldn't tolerate it for that long. I looked on the Steam achievements, and only about 6% of the game's players actually beat the game at all. I'm one of slightly less than 3% that beat it on the normal difficulty setting, and the writing being so insufferably bad is a major part of that, not least of which is the way it treats women, which is blatantly misogynist. Now before you start screaming, DW is an SJW, understand this simple fact. The game treats women like they're basically trophies, and what I mean by that is you will actually come across various female characters in the game that are being harassed by men. You kill those men, And immediately, not after some period of time, not after maybe some character development or a conversation, no, immediately after that person's corpse hits the ground, the game cuts over to a cutscene of Jake having sex with that woman. Or in one cutscene's case, about 4 women. And honestly, the only thing that prevents it from being downright sickening is the fact that the characters are all having sex completely clothed, and the animations are hilariously terrible. Quite literally, the only point in the game that has any nudity in it whatsoever is the strip club level, which has a couple of the dancers being topless. Yet during the actual sex scenes, they're just humping and completely clothed. Doesn't make any sense. And what makes even less sense is that this happens in the middle of you just going through a level. For example, right in the middle of when I was chasing a guy down, there was a damsel in distress that I had to save. And of course, immediately after saving her, Jake ends up having sex with her, and it cuts immediately back to what I was doing before, which was just wandering through the level trying to chase a guy down. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to sex scenes in video games if they're done well, but this was quite literally the inclusion of sex scenes just to have them, and they're done so poorly that you might as well not have put them in the game to begin with. And speaking of not putting things into the game to begin with, how about pretty much everything? Where do I even begin with this? I guess I'll start with the mandatory driving segments where you're on your motorcycle, and they're all ludicrously linear, and by ludicrously linear I mean you're on a set path that has walls on either side, so you can't actually veer off and go your own way. There is no open world of any kind in this other than the actual town of Dead End, which is just a hub. But I'll get to that in a minute. The actual driving mechanics feel incredibly floaty and awkward. It is actually really hard to steer your motorcycle particularly well unless you're just making very, very slight adjustments. If all you need is to list lazily to the left or right, well, you're fine. But if you need to make a sharp turn, guess what? You're gonna go bouncing off the railings. In fact, there were numerous moments where when I was driving the motorcycle around, I bounced off a railing and the physics glitched out to the point where it actually did a 360, which then engaged the mechanic that it uses to reset your location if you run into something, which is that it will fade to black and just drop you right into the middle of the road at some point. Only when it did that, apparently because the game was deciding it wanted to have a glitch party, it just instantly killed me, and thus I had to load a checkpoint. And that becomes incredibly tiring during these driving segments because you're quite literally doing nothing but moving forward. You can't go backward at all because if you try to do that, then of course it won't let you go backward to begin with. And if you start going backward, then it's just going to reset you into the middle of the track and going forward. But what's even better is that these driving segments are completely pointless. The majority of them are just simply going from point A to point B with not really much in between other than maybe an obstacle you have to jump over or an obstacle you have to slide under or a bunch of enemies that will run up to you and make you mash buttons in order to take them out. Sometimes they'll even slap a timer on there that you have to beat, but you're always going to beat the timer anyway, so why do they even bother with it? But sometimes they actually shake up the driving segments by making you have these shooting segments in them where you're driving your motorcycle and then time slows down so you're in slow motion shooting at various enemies until they die, and then they end up careening off to one side or the other, usually the right side of the track, and just randomly exploding because reasons. Hell, at one point I actually found out you can do those rage finishers that you can do in the melee combat on the bikes as well, and it is goofy and literally nothing more than just mashing a bunch of buttons and watching a mini cutscene of you attempting to be badass. And it only happened 3 times in the entire game. Again, why bother? I mean, I get that the game is a biker game, so obviously you're going to have biker driving and racing segments, and the races suck, by the way. You basically always win because the enemy AI is too stupid to win, so even that feels hastily slapped together and just tacked on to the game at the last minute. In fact, the only thing that doesn't feel tacked on as far as the bike stuff goes is the bike customization. There's actually a lot of bike customization options, various parts that you can throw on there, various paint jobs. It's actually legitimately surprising just how many customization options are available for your bike considering how everything else is so incredibly limited. But hey, credits due where credits due. It's one of the very, very few things about this game that is not downright terrible. Once you get past the bike stuff, you find that this is basically a third-person shooter with a really crappy melee combat system. Let's do the melee stuff first. You have a basic attack, which is mostly just punching things, and then you have a heavy attack, which is you kicking things, and then you have a block button, which also doubles as your counter button. There are also melee weapons you can use, which I kept picking up even though I wasn't actually picking any up. For some reason, I would have a wrench in one moment, and then a baton in the next, and then a big old pipe in another one. It didn't make any sense at all. The point is that it's a generic melee weapon class that mostly just differs in very, very slight changes in the animations. Maybe certain weapons do more damage than others, I really don't know, because I barely used the melee combat in this game at all, and when I did use it, I cheesed it. You see, it turns out you don't really have to use the various combos that you can unlock by purchasing them in the upgrade menu, even though I did do that just because I had so much money at that point that I was like, okay, well, might as well buy literally everything ever. But I certainly didn't need them, and even though they do slightly help with damage output, it's not really that much, and it's kind of pointless anyway because you can just use guns. You see, guns get instant kills when you headshot enemies. So you can either sit there and fight a group of enemies for a good 10 minutes or so in the melee combat, or you can spend a few seconds just popping them all in the head, and then move on. I think the choice is pretty obvious there, although there are some enemies you can't pop in the head. They walk around with hockey masks on and are basically Jason Voorhees with a machine gun of some kind or a shotgun. See, for some bizarre reason they're immune to headshots, so with those guys instead you have to just do a bunch of body shots, and even then it's pretty easy because the enemy AI in this game is wonderful. Melee guys all charge you directly, making it incredibly easy for you to just pick them all off before they even get anywhere near you, and all the other guys with guns actually duck into cover, except for the big guys in the hockey masks, and they are incredibly easy to get headshots on as well, partly because they tend to take cover as a mild suggestion rather than actually important, and so they stick their heads out way too often to make it incredibly easy to take them down, and partly because they're actually pretty terrible shots. They don't really hit you very much, particularly at longer ranges, so you can just sit back and pick them off with incredible ease. The only exceptions are when a bunch of dudes rush you all at once and there's guys shooting at you, which isn't really all that often in the game and isn't really that big of a problem because headshots are so easy to get. Which may sound kind of odd because you do see me missing an awful lot in this gameplay footage, and that is because the controls in this game are downright horrible. While the button presses tend to be pretty responsive, when you're actually trying to use the mouse to aim or look around, it has a very odd floaty quality to it, to where you try to aim at a person and it moves horizontally but not vertically how you actually tried to make it. Movements that you're incredibly used to making in any shooter on PC at all almost never work in this thing. It just ends up having a bizarre mind of its own with regards to where it's going to actually try to aim, and so you have to really adjust it a lot before you actually manage to get a headshot. That's why I'm constantly missing and just kind of walking my shots into wherever the enemy's head is. Admittedly, you get a lot more used to it over time, so the footage that's more from the end of the game is going to have a lot better accuracy than when I was actually starting out playing. But frankly, there shouldn't be an adjustment period for how incredibly crappy the aiming mechanic is. Aiming in a shooter is something we nailed back in the 90s, and if you're going with a console shooter, it's something that's basically been nailed down since the early 2000s. Why it's so damn awful in this is utterly beyond me. And even once you get past the ridiculously bad aiming, it doesn't matter which guns you're using because all of them have the same property. You get a headshot with them, the guy instantly falls over. So it doesn't really matter whether you're using the really crappy revolver that you start with or the ultra awesome Magnum pistol that you can get later on in the game. Although honestly, the upgrade there was kind of hilariously bad as well because I was able to get the best rifle and pistol in the game basically within the first 3 levels. From then on, quite literally all I was using the in-game currency for, after of course buying all the upgrades for the character, which were pointless by the way, is ammo. You see, whenever you drop an enemy in this game, they tend to drop money, and that means you're going to be swimming in money by the end of the game and not have anything to spend it on at all. You see, the only things you actually spend money on are weapons, ammo, and those various upgrades that give you better combos and better melee damage and things like that. They're all incredibly wimpy upgrades as well, so you're just gonna go in with the best weapon that you can get, and you're going to be like, okay, I'm not gonna even bother with the melee at all because it's tedious. I mean, stun locking an enemy with kicks is only amusing the first couple of times you do it, after all. So you're like, oh, maybe I can spend all the money on getting the various weapons throughout the game, and sure you can, except that you're not really going to need to bother with too many of them, because once you get the best rifle, you don't need anything else. So eventually you just get tired of picking up all the junk that the enemies drop, and you're like, you know what, screw it, I'm just going to continue on without picking up any of this loot. And it turns out you're perfectly fine that way. You can pick up ammo of the same weapon type that you're using off of dead enemies, so it's not like you even need to buy ammo either. Thus, the hub ends up being completely pointless, other than the bike customization, which is also pointless. So let's take a look at the running tally. Completely pointless and downright creepy and disgusting sex scenes when you really think about it. Completely pointless melee combat that it does force you into a couple times throughout the game, but otherwise is really not much of a thing. Gunplay that may well be the absolute worst I've ever seen in a shooter. Driving mechanics that make the game big rigs look good. Utterly worthless loot drops and upgrade system. Melee weapons that just randomly pop up in your hands and randomly change to other melee weapons throughout the game for no discernible reason. And what about other pointless things they threw in the game? How about the rage attacks, where when you're in the middle of a melee combo or in the middle of driving your motorcycle around, you can press a button to have Jake get angry in a rather amusing sense.
What the hell happened?
Followed by a series of QuickTime events that have you finishing the enemy off in a pointless display of violence. Again, why was this included? There's no reason for it. I mean, sure, they also included environmental kills that you can trigger, but I rarely did those because I was very rarely using melee around the actual trigger areas for them. And even then, it's just a finisher animation, so it's not like it's that big of a deal anyway. But hey, if all that pointless bullshit wasn't enough for you, guess what? There are also collectibles. You can find bike paints, you can find bike parts, you can find cards scattered throughout the levels, which serve absolutely no purpose. They're quite literally just there for bragging rights, or whatever. And speaking of bragging rights, what is with the boss fights in this game? They all are ridiculously easy or just downright tedious. Some of them have you chasing down a guy on bike and trying to mow him down with a machine gun, and eventually it'll trigger a cutscene where you finish him off in some fashion. But a couple of them are actually boss fights where you're actually legitimately fighting the guy, and those are the most hilariously pathetic ones of them all. Although honestly nothing beats one of the earlier boss fights in the game where the guy is on a turret and I was able to just continually pick him off because the AI could not recognize me as actually being out in the open for him to hit. Yes, the absolutely atrocious AI has problems with the boss fights too. It's amazing. So the boss fights end up just not being remotely challenging and more just busy work than anything else when you get down to it. They're just kind of bullet sponges when you try to actually shoot at them. And it just decides at arbitrary points to say, okay, well now's the cutscene time. In which case you might have a QuickTime event, but in a lot of cases you don't. And speaking of QuickTime events, there are actually some of them in the game you don't even need to bother with. During certain cutscenes, you can actually just not press any buttons even though it's telling you to press those buttons, and the thing will just play out anyway. Why on earth would you ever put interactive elements in a cutscene if they are completely and utterly pointless? All they do is accelerate the time it takes to actually continue the cutscene. They are completely pointless. And even the ones that do serve a point just aren't very interesting. I mean, the entire final boss fight is basically a QuickTime event. And it's a QuickTime event of you mashing a button so Jake can actually push the guy's eyes in. That's it. And hell, the final boss doesn't even really react to that very much. He's just kind of like, oh, that hurt. And that's the case with a lot of moments in this game. The game thinks it's being badass when it's just being incredibly lame. or in some cases, downright hilariously stupid. To give you a prime example, there is the infamous fence scenario. In one mission, Jake comes up against an electrified fence. Instead of trying to find a way to shut down the power directly to the fence, or trying to find a way around the fence or a gap in the fence, or just, you know, crash through it or destroy the fence. No, instead of doing any of that, what Jake decides is the simplest and best course of action is to go across the street to a gas station, annihilate a bunch of truckers for no discernible reason, take their truck, drive it across town to the power plant, go through the power plant, slaughtering everyone inside, go to the other side of the power plant, which is a dam, by the way, so he's going across a river, effectively, and then shoot the tanker from a vantage point so it can cause a chain reaction that destroys the power plant and has an explosion occur behind him so he can jump in slow motion into the river. And honestly, that is the only moment in the entire game where it hits so incredibly stupid that it's hilarious. And it was that one moment that made me go, oh, well, maybe there's more moments in this game to where it can be kind of like Rogue Warrior in its a so bad it's hilarious sense. But that was the only one. The more you play this game, the worse it gets. It ends up going past so terrible it's hilarious all the way back to it's terrible again, and it just keeps spiraling downward until you hit rock bottom. And at that point, you ask yourself, beyond simply, why the fuck did I play this? The simple question of, why does this even exist? Why in the living hell did this get pulled out of cancellation to get a full release, only to eventually get pulled from sale? Yes, the game is such a disaster that the publishers pulled it from sale. And for good reason. They shouldn't have released it to begin with. The game was released in a basically unplayable state. Luckily, they patched it to some degree, so most of the catastrophic bugs are gone. But on launch, it was effectively unplayable. And if it was gonna get released in that particular state, again, why did it get released at all? Why didn't it just stay cancelled? I guess they thought they could try to recover some of the losses they got from spending a lot of money on it, but was the massive hit to the reputation of the developer and the publisher really worth it? Of course it wasn't. And what we ended up getting is one of the worst games ever made. Not the worst, but one of the worst. It's actually kind of unbelievable just how incredibly bad this game is. You go into it thinking, oh, it couldn't possibly be as bad as people say it is. And to some degree, again, that's correct. It's not quite the worst game ever made. But it is, again, one of the worst. And you just sit there slack-jawed half the time going, how the fuck did this make it past the cutting room floor? And you know what? I had hoped that I would never actually have to use this, but this game actually earned it. The very first of my 0 out of 5s. Luckily, the publisher did the right thing and realized just how catastrophic of a mistake they had made and pulled the game from Steam. But this still goes down in history as one of the worst games ever made, and it's on their watch, which is pretty sad. Hopefully this will be the only game they ever put out of this poor quality. But we'll have to see on that. Thanks for watching.